Welcome to SpyCast, the official podcast of the International Spy Museum. I'm Erin Dietrich, and your host is Dr. Andrew Hammond. Each week, we explore some aspect of the past, present, or future of intelligence and espionage. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you want to dig even deeper into the content of this week's episode, you can find links to further resources, suggested readings, and full transcripts at cyberwire.com/podcasts/spycast. Coming up next on SpyCast.
After dinner, Kennedy says to Fleming, what would James Bond do about Castro? It's not a frivolous question, which I think too often it's been seen as. He's really asking, what would Ian Fleming do about Castro?
This week's guest is Nicholas Shakespeare, author of the new biography, Ian Fleming, The Complete Man. This is the first authorized biography of Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, since 1966. In this episode, Andrew and Nicholas discuss the complicated and often quite misunderstood life of Ian Fleming. They'll talk about his family and his upbringing. They'll debunk a couple of misconceptions about Fleming's character. And they'll discuss Fleming's career in naval intelligence during World War II, a career that would inspire the iconic 007. The original podcast on intelligence since 2006, we are SpyCast. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Well, it's a pleasure to speak to you, Nicholas. Thanks for coming to speak to me about your biography on Ian Fleming.
No, the pleasure's mine.
And I'm just wondering, you make an interesting point in the book. People think of Le Carré before they think of George Smiley, but with Ian Fleming, it's the opposite. They think of Bond before they think of Fleming. So I think that this is quite an interesting opportunity for our listeners to try to understand a little bit more about who Ian Fleming was. And you've had access to previously unpublished materials. You've spent a long period of time researching this. So I'm looking forward to exploring that a little bit more. But just before we get there, how did you end up writing this book? How did it fall in your lap?
Well, I'm a novelist before I'm a biographer, and I was living in my own Golden Eye, which is a bungalow on the Strand in Tasmania, right at the end of the world, when about 5 years ago I was contacted by my agent who said, we've got a rather interesting approach from the Fleming estate. They would like you to write the first authorized biography of Ian Fleming since John Pearson's biography in 1966. Would you be interested? And although I was immensely flattered and knew that this was a big, juicy subject, I confess that my first reaction was hesitation. For me, I hadn't really, although I'd grown up on James Bond and read all his books under a blue blanket in my preparatory school by a dim torchlight, and I'd seen the films, I wasn't really a paid-up member of the James Bond fan club. I had kind of glimpsed Ian Fleming through sideways glances in my previous book, which may have been why the family approached me. This was a non-fiction book about Churchill coming to power in 1940, following the disastrous campaign in Norway, which Churchill had been responsible for. And in that campaign, the first British officer, a kind of prototype commando, to land in occupied Europe in the Second World War was Peter Fleming, Ian Fleming's elder brother. And he was a person of extraordinary valor and talent. And I went to the family and asked if I could have any, diaries or anything that might help me understand the Norway campaign. So that book came out, and I think they must have liked how I treated the material. But as I say, my impression of Fleming, Ian, was of a kind of sardonic bounder, a rather arrogant public school boy who had betrayed a lot of women and smoked and drank his way through life. I had a kind of caricature of a tabloid caricature. One of the morals of his story, it struck me only recently, is don't run off with the wife of the owner of the Daily Mail if you wish to avoid forever after being rendered into tabloid fat, which is what has happened. And I think I'd absorbed this tabloid image of a kind of bounder who came back late from his golf club or London club in his fast car, screeched to a halt outside his house in Victoria Square, climbed the stairs past his wife's smart friends who would be looking at him as he waved airily at them as he went up to his monastic top-floor bedroom and then pulled the sheets over his face to stop himself hearing the sniggers as they dissected his latest book below. I think that was the image I had of him through the Daily Mail and other papers. And I thought, do I really want to spend 3 or 4 years in the company of a cad? And so I asked the Fleming estate, I said, let me do some due diligence. Let me spend a couple of months seeing if I want to do this. So I looked at the material they had offered, which was unpublished letters they had, nothing too dramatic, but interesting that it was new. I mean, he's a slightly over-tilled vineyard like Churchill and Napoleon, but anything new is quite interesting. So I then went to see whoever, not many people who are alive still, but the few people who remembered him. He died in 1964, age 56, and I'm surprised there aren't that many surviving witnesses to him. But I interviewed his stepdaughter, Fiona Morgan, who is one of the probably only people alive who remember seeing him naked when she was 14. And I began to... Two things happened that emerged that I hadn't expected. The first was that he was a much kinder person than I'd hitherto expected. Again and again, the word kindness was used to describe him by both his male and his female friends. I mean, although Rebecca West said that all the women who were in love with Ian Fleming could have filled the Albert Hall, it seemed that most of them remained very close to him and kept on loving him long after the affair had petered out. This was particularly true of a woman called Maud Russell, who had bought Goldeneye for him after the war, and with whom he had an affair during the war, and who was quite crucial in getting him into intelligence and before that into banking, where he was a kind of deplorable banker and stockbroker. And it was Maud Russell's journal, unpublished, which I got hold of, which 7 years after his death, she writes this amazing entry saying, I think of Ian, above all, of his kindliness. Now, kindliness is not an epithet you associate with James Bond, but it was repeated again and again by women like Rosamund Lehman and by women like Mary Pakenham, and then by his male friends. And he had a very loyal coterie of mainly school friends who he kept really through to the end of his life, with whom he played golf and bridge. These people weren't particularly exciting, but they were all, almost without exception, upstanding people who would not have tolerated the company of a cad. So that struck me as interesting. For a biographer, to discover an unexpected feature like kindness is always quite a beguiling lure. The second thing was that he was much more important than I'd been led to believe. I mean, the popular image of him, the tabloid image of him, is that Ian Fleming is just, during the war, his 6 years in naval intelligence, he was just he cleared out trays, in trays and ashtrays. He was
a sort of minor
sailor,
desk jockey.
A totally minor desk jockey who didn't go out and risk his life like many of his friends. Many of his friends, their children died or they died, and he sat safely in his smart uniform behind his desk in room 39, directly below Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty. He certainly was not this kind of in-tray, out-tray and ashtray person. He certainly wasn't this unpopular bounder. But there was a third factor that led to me deciding to do this book. And writers are very superstitious as well as skeptical. I think superstition and skepticism are two of the writer's guiding stars. And I became spookily receptive to one or two tiny twinkles that suggested this was a propitious subject for me. First of all, John Pearson, the first authorized biographer, was still alive, and my father, to whom I've dedicated this biography, told me that he had shared a desk with John Pearson in 1953 when they worked at the Times Literary Supplement together in London. And I brought them back together 66 years later. And it turned out that John Pearson had then gone on to work for Ian Fleming on the Sunday Times in the same position that my father had gone on to work for Frank Giles, who became Fleming's successor on the Sunday Times as the foreign manager. So that all these kind of totally unimportant connections made me, all these connections, the discovery that Fleming was more important and kinder led to me finally saying, yes, I will do this biography.
I think it would be quite interesting to just touch on his family background a little bit. So his grandfather really bootstraps his way up from, like you say, a slum in Dundee. Then he has a father, Valentine Fleming, who Churchill writes his obituary when he dies. He dies in 1917 in the First World War. He has the nightmare of younger siblings, older brother, who's just successful at everything he does. Very difficult to live up to. But like you say, people remember Ian, not so much Peter. So let's just briefly talk about that family environment, the Flemings, the sort of narrative arc of the Fleming family from the slums of Dundee to Ian, who's on, first name terms with the great and the good and on both sides of the Atlantic. Talk a little bit more about the family Fleming.
Okay, I'll begin by talking about Churchill, because it always struck me as an enigma. Why are the Flemings so close to Churchill, who would come and shoot at the grandfather's house near Henley, this vast house called Joyce Grove, which had 44 bedrooms? And Churchill then wrote the obituary for Fleming's father, Val, a marvellous obituary in the Times in 1917, after he was killed in France when Fleming is only 8. And what is extraordinary is how the Fleming father and his brother, Philip, had both, they'd been in Churchill's regiment, the Oxfordshire Hussars. And I thought, what is this son of a kind of, not a peasant, but a kind of slum dweller, going to Eton and Oxford and rowing at Henley? How has he got, in one generation, into bed with Churchill, so to speak? I mean, it's quite an illustration of the mobility of England at that time. We think of England as rigidly class structured, but actually, this is an example of how fluid it was. And I had to go to Dundee for it to be explained to me. The taxi driver was moaning that, no one knows about Ian Fleming or James Bond in Dundee. They don't really know he came from here. And then he suddenly looks at the Queen's Hotel. He says, that's where Churchill used to come when he was an MP. And both me and James Fleming, who I was with, Ian's nephew, who had never been to Dundee before, we were astonished that Churchill had been MP in Dundee. And it turned out exactly at the same period that Robert Fleming was setting up his bank in London in 1908, 1909. So Robert Fleming was probably the richest Dundonian in history. And of course, Churchill would beat a path to his door in London. And of course, he'd want to go shooting with him. The complication was that when Val dies in 1917, the share of the bank, which it was 3-part share with his father and his brother, it diverted back to the father and brother, and it didn't rest with, Val's widow and his 4 children. And then the bank becomes more and more successful. It runs Anglo-Persian Oil, which becomes BP. And, by the time 1930, Robert Fleming's in charge of kind of £3 trillion worth of business. And none of this is trickling down, or very little, to Ian Fleming. And I think so, although he was a grandson of poverty and a son of wealth, he was not himself wealthy. And his other important influence, apart from his brother, who, as you say, was he's one of the most famous Oldetonians ever been, effortless in everything he did, so that Ian was forced by contrast, to become a black sheep. He was probably forced to become much more of a black sheep than he naturally was. But he didn't go to Oxford. He failed to get into the army, but he had gonorrhea. He tried to get into the Foreign Office, he failed. He then spent a lot of his time in Kitzbühel in Austria, sleeping with lots of attractive Austrian girls. So I think he was forced into being a black sheep more than his probably quite upright character, elements in his upright character would have wanted. But what's happened to him is that he found his kind of métier in Reuters. He got into Reuters through his mother. The mother is probably important to mention here. She was very beautiful, but an absolute nightmare of a mother, because she decided what his job should be. She wanted him to go into the Foreign Office, and if that wasn't going to work, she got him into Reuters, and then she got him out of that to go into banking. She wanted him to go into the Fleming Bank, which he just wasn't suited for at all. And then she decided on his girlfriends, on where he took his holidays, and she was a kind of nightmare who held the purse strings. I mean, he had to depend on her handouts right up until the end of his life. I mean, he only survived her by 2 weeks. And so you have to think of this man overshadowed by his elder brother, overshadowed by his dominating mother, who actually squirms for a lot of his life to escape these two presences. And it's significant that the mother only once visited Goldeneye, and I think finds it too uncomfortable and soon moves out to a hotel. And Peter Fleming never visited Goldeneye once. So for Fleming, Goldeneye was a kind of Fleming-free zone in which he could mine out his own territory, which he did very successfully. So that what happens in his first years as a young man, basically he's a playboy. I mean, he's attractive, he earns some money. After he doesn't get into the Foreign Office, he works for a bit for Reuters and shows what a good journalist he is, and goes to Moscow and covers the kind of Stalinist trials and does it incredibly effectively and has an appetite for journalism. And I think in Reuters he learns about succinct writing, about getting the truth first and quickly. It was a very important training for him, and he did say if he was ever to be born again, he'd love to go become a news cameraman. So it'd be interesting to know what he would have done with his news camera in these days. But his mother again interfered with his Reuters thing and made him leave Reuters to join a bank for which he was totally ill-suited. He was meant to be the worst stockbroker on earth. And he just spent the time with his mates, playing golf, drinking, sleeping with women, and having a good time. And so it was rather extraordinary that he would have been selected to have been the personal assistant for the Director of Naval Intelligence in 1939.
It's interesting when you're discussing the Flemings, and I was just thinking of the Churchills, because their elevation, the elevation of that family within British society occurred much earlier, right? With John Churchill, becomes the Duke of Marlborough, Blenheim Palace, where Winston Churchill was born. But your point is that in the 20th century, the Flemings can come along and get inserted into that class structure. And Valentine goes on to become an MP as well, Fleming's father. So I think there's lots of interesting stuff going on there. So I want to dig more into the intelligence part, obviously, because of our listeners. But just before we get there, just to round out the social history of Ian Fleming, let's just briefly talk about Anne, his wife. She's a really fascinating character and figure. Both of them are having affairs left, right, and centre. Both of them have a very coloured kind of past. Like, what's going on there? Is this the norm for the social class, or did they have an open marriage? Is this common for the social class of the time, or is this atypical? And is there tension within the marriage because of this, or is this kind of accepted as sort of open-ish?
Wow. So, well, let's try and unpick this. I mean, let's begin in the war. I think we have to remember that during the war, Len Dayton told me that, you said goodbye to somebody as if you were never going to see them again. And so
This is the First World War.
Second World War. So 1939. So Fleming is 31 when the war begins. And he has a girl who he's been having an affair with, who he's decided he's going to marry her. And he's about to go up to Yorkshire to ask her father for his daughter's hand in marriage, and the girl is killed by a flying bomb in London. This is Muriel Wright in 1944. I think Fleming in the war, when we think of Bond and the kind of steaminess of Bond's sexuality, which we almost misread as Fleming being modern in his, predicting the swinging 60s, almost bringing it in. Well, actually, that's a misreading, because all Fleming is doing is reheating the humid sexuality of the Blitz, in which people slept with each other the whole time. And, a moral norm was suspended because you didn't think you were going to see each other again. You might be killed. And so there was a lot of sex in the Blitz. And Fleming uses Bond in the Cold War to basically reheats that old cabbage. So Bond is having Blitz sex in the Cold War, so to speak. I think marriage, divorce, we have to remember, is a stigma. People don't get divorced, so that if you don't get divorced and you have an unhappy marriage, there's more latitude to allow your wife or husband to stray without it being a finalizing end to your union. And it's interesting that Fleming's bridge partners in the war, he has, he's sleeping with their wives. Lord Rothermere, he's sleeping with Anne Rothermere. He's sleeping with a lot of his best friends' wives without kind of any moral compunction. And I think it leaves a very unpleasant taste in the mouth. But I think we have to launch ourselves back into the moral complications of the late 1930s and the war. Going to Anne Fleming. So she's an aristocrat, unlike Ian. She met him in 1937 in France at one of the French resorts. Immediately was struck by his attractiveness, but also the fact that he wasn't going to be owned by anybody. And I think he should never have married anyway, and he certainly shouldn't have married her. And I think it's another example of Fleming. He's a bit like Bruce Chatwin, an English writer I also wrote a biography about, of whom almost anything you say of me, the opposite is also true. So Chatwin, like Fleming, is a kind of scrum of people, all quite contradictory. So you can say of Fleming, oh, he was James Bond. Somebody else says, no, he was nothing to do with James Bond. Somebody could say, oh, he loved art. No, he hated art. Oh, he was obsessed by money. He hated money. So it's rather difficult to tread your path between these contradictory messages that flash out of this man. And one of them is that he ends up marrying a woman who's the complete opposite to himself. She loved society. She loved home life. He loved traveling. He couldn't bear domestication. In almost every aspect of their life, they were contradictory. And I suppose what had been exciting when it was all forbidden fruit became almost the moment they got married a horror story. And I think she wakes up the day after they marry in Jamaica thinking she's married a stranger. And I think he wakes up thinking he's also married a stranger. And there's not much generosity that goes on after that. I think they do love each other, but it's not a love that lends itself to being in wedlock. And so I don't think there's not much evidence to prove that he's very unfaithful after the marriage. I think all his infidelities took place before marriage, and I think he was quite an upright figure in that. I think he felt that once you married, you were faithful. And I've only found one affair, which is a very important affair for him, with Chris Blackwell's mother, Blanche Blackwell, who kind of came to Fleming's rescue when Anne was making him completely miserable. I mean, just to give an example of Anne's, she's a very brilliant kind of, she likes prodding people into kind of reacting. She loves a fight. She loves these dinner parties she gives 2 or 3 times a week in London. She just loved it if everyone's flying at each other's throats. And Fleming kind of sits there watching with horror as England's upper classes, their most important politicians and actors and artists file through the drawing room to kind of argue with each other. And he goes up to bed, pulling his hair out at her need to be constantly in the centre of attention. It is an interesting attention because it's a portrait of England, England at that period. But I'm not. Fleming's an outsider watching in, a voyeur. It's not his natural pleasant habitat. He's much happier in Jamaica, going snorkeling underwater by himself, watching coral reefs and tropical fish. and being at his desk, finally writing the books he'd always possibly wanted to write ever since he was a student in Austria. But I think one of Anne's, it's difficult to capture Anne in a way that's sympathetic, because she seems like a coral you bring up from the sea, that probably amongst her own community and family and friends, she would have been colourful and attractive, and you could have seen her lights. But as soon as you bring her up out of her natural surrounds, she just seems to defy an ability to kind of resuscitate her in an empathetic way. At least I found that.
And she has an affair with Hugh Gaitskell, the leader of the opposition. So in American terms, this would be similar to a presidential candidate from a major political party or something. This is while she's married to Fleming, right?
This is when she's married to Fleming. I mean, it's the most extraordinary. I was doing the dates of everything, and on the very day that Fleming is arranging for the British Prime Minister, Anthony Eton, to go to Goldeneye in the middle of the Suez Crisis, which has been a catastrophe for England, a bit like Brexit, Eton wants to go and recuperate in the Caribbean in Fleming's house. So Fleming's arranging with him in November 1956 his bedroom for Eton to take over. On the same day, Anne is in bed with the leader of the opposition in Paris, in a hotel in Paris. And you have to get your head around the neatness of this symmetry.
One critical piece of Ian Fleming's life that did not make this episode is his son, Caspar. Caspar was born in August of 1952, only a couple of months after Ian and Anne were married. After his birth, Fleming wrote in a letter to a friend, "If it were possible to make a better man out of me, he is certainly assisting in the process." Fleming would often tell Caspar stories of a magical flying car. Yes, a story that would eventually become Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Ian absolutely adored his son, who he lovingly called 003½. Unfortunately, Caspar's childhood was plagued by the infidelity of both of his parents and his father's untimely death in 1964. Ian Fleming died on Caspar's 12th birthday. He became known as a sort of troubled child. He was educated at Eton, like his father, but later dropped out of Oxford in his second year. He was quite intelligent, particularly interested in Egyptology and archaeology, but became worn from the pressure of school and suffered from severe depression. In 1974, Caspar made a trip to Goldeneye, now his inherited property, where he attempted to take his own life by swimming out to sea after taking a lethal amount of drugs. Thankfully, he was saved, but he never truly recovered. He passed away less than a month later in London. He was 23 years old. Anne wrote, "Caspar tried to come to terms with life for my sake, and then suddenly could not try anymore." He was buried alongside his father, and on Caspar's grave was written, "To cease upon the midnight with no pain."
Let's pivot on to discuss Fleming and intelligence. At the beginning, you brought up this idea that, he was some low-level administrator in the Admiralty, but you uncovered that the story is actually much richer and much deeper. So help us understand that a little bit more. So the way that he ends up working for the director of naval intelligence, Admiral Godfrey, is through the old boys network, really, the way you describe it in the book. He's not, on paper anyway, particularly likely to be a candidate for the position, but the way you describe it in the book, it actually almost seemed like the perfect position for him. He has international connections, he's well connected, he's got the journalistic background, he knows how to write, he's got a very vivid imagination, so he almost falls into the perfect job for him during the war, but it's not like the way that everybody's thought about it. He's just some naval functionary who's sitting at a desk. Like, put some more colour on that. I think the way to start off is just by covert operations. This is one that we hear about a lot. So why was he doing that? Why was the director of naval intelligence involved in this? Help our listeners understand that a little bit more.
Well, before we get to the war, I ought to say that many of the people who he'd been at school with, his headmaster at his prep school, was a scout for naval intelligence also. Then when he goes to Kitzbühel when he's about 18 or 19, his tutor there, Ernest Forbes Dennis, is also a scout for the Foreign Office and for intelligence. And then he joins this bank, this stockbrokers, Rowan Pittman, and the man who's the senior partner there, he's also worked in naval intelligence, and he's a scout for naval intelligence. And so what you realize is that, and then Fleming had worked at Reuters for a man called Bernard Ricketson Hatt, who was the chief editor, and Ricketson Hatt was in intelligence. And so many of the people Fleming had kind of brushed up against were very involved in intelligence and would have been able to vouch for those elements in his character, both bad and good, which would have lent him to the attention of Admiral Godfrey. I mean, I think one of the blows, which is hard to remind ourselves of, is that one of Fleming's contemporaries at Eton, Guy Burgess, who was at Eton with Fleming in 1924, becomes one of the big betrayers of British intelligence. I think that was a blow, to this small, tight community that trusted each other and relied on trusting each other. That was quite devastating. And I think, again, is a feature behind Fleming's first book, Casino Royale. I think he's trying to resuscitate the British intelligence service as a good thing to try and restore its reputation and lustre after it had been damaged so badly by Burgess and Maclean and later on by Philby.
So just very briefly for our listeners, Burgess and Maclean, this is around 1953. They defect to the Soviet Union, 52, 53.
They defect
before Casino Royale comes out.
Yes, they defect in 51, I think. I can't remember. It's early 50s. They suddenly defect. No one knows if it's to the Soviet Union, but they disappear. And they take, it's worried that they have, because they're so much in the centre of British intelligence. Burgess had worked in Maclean and Burgess. Between them, they had knowledge of American intelligence, American atomic intelligence. They had a knowledge of British intelligence. And so this was a devastating. The two moles inside British intelligence. And it's why the Americans ended up never trusting us again, added to Philby's betrayal later on. Again, Fleming had known Philby in the 30s. These are all some of the elements that make up Bond, or why Fleming makes Bond such a patriotic figure. It's a kind of compensatory act for the slight disasters that the British intelligence service had endured. But I think, so going back to, he joins this slightly, understaffed naval intelligence unit in 1939. It had been, in the 30s, it had been allowed to kind of really be run down. And so he has somebody in his position who has a bit of whiz and contacts and can show that he's quite impressive, suddenly becomes much bigger than his rank as a commander might suggest. I mean, he's rewriting all Churchill sending out orders every day from above, and Fleming is the person instructed to answer Churchill's prayers, as they're called. And he knows from Reuters how to do this in a language that Churchill will understand. If he bumps into Churchill in the corridor, Churchill will recognize the son of his great friend Val Fleming. So there's an insider fluidity that allows him quick access to the powers that be and to the movers and shakers, so he can ring up somebody immediately and get things done. I think in a way that probably we are able to do less these days. I'm not in intelligence, but I would imagine it's less easy.
You discussed that during the war, outside of number 10, the foreign side of the British government machine is really dominated by Oregonians. We've got Anthony Eden, Lord Halifax, Cadogan, Vansittart, Harold Macmillan, Duff Cooper, the two ministers responsible for the Special Operations Executive, the heads of the two secret services. But then it says, one of the people says, it did a lot to facilitate relationships and promote efficiency. So there's this almost cultural shorthand because they've all been to Eton. But then the point that you make is that somebody like Burgess ruptures that inner sanctum cultural trust, and that also leads me on to the question: Did Fleming know Burgess?
He was at a party waiting to have Burgess come to dinner when Burgess doesn't turn up, and Anthony Blunt is there and says, "Oh, I don't think he'll be coming." Anthony Blunt had that afternoon helped clear Burgess's flat. Burgess had in fact left for San Malo about 4 days earlier. It's hard to know if Fleming knew him. He wouldn't have known him very well, but they would have sat, opposite each other in chapel in 1924. He would have known his face. It's hard to know if it was anything more than that. I'm glad you touched on Eton, because it's one of the spooky coincidences when I was approached to do this book is that my son was then at Eton in the same house as Fleming's house, the Timbrels, where both Ian and Peter Fleming were. And there was a Fleming room there which had been established for Peter Fleming. Now nobody's heard of Peter Fleming, and so the room is full of kind of covers of Bond movies and first edition jackets. But that allowed me, and my son, like Fleming, got into pop, so was able to show me the inner sanctum, which no master's allowed to see, the room where pop happens. And so I went in there one day, and, Fleming...
What's pop, sorry?
Pop is the kind of self-elected elite of prefects that run the school. And Fleming, in a sense, was characterized as somebody who wanted to continue pop the rest of his life, creating self-appointed elites in the Sunday Times or in intelligence. And it was very important, the Eton aspect of Fleming. I felt if I cracked that, I would understand the rest of Fleming's life. And I was able to crack it through my son, who was in the same house, as I said.
So, and in the book you mention that quite a few women said that he had nice legs. So potentially he could have been on The Bachelor or something like that if they were casting.
Well, he was apparently, people who watched it, he was determined when he was in Austria. He just climbed the mountain, the Kitzbühel Horn, whenever he could. And he would scale it, struggling and sweating, and then have a shower afterwards, as if it was something to be kind of conquered. And I imagine that gave him his lean legs.
And I mean, I think it's quite interesting to me as well, the Scottish connection. So you say in the book that he is a patriotic Scot, and his father's born in Scotland. His grandfather's originally from Scotland. Fleming, obviously, quite a Scottish name. How? Tell us a little bit more about that, and was that a barrier to being accepted or welcomed into the sort of English upper class? Was that
not
something
at all? He doesn't speak with a Scottish accent, although his grandfather did. No, I think Bond is Scotland is an important part of Bond's makeup, and he refuses an honour, I think, by saying he's a Scottish peasant. And Fleming very much liked that attitude, and he's also Scottish on his mother's side. I think Eve Fleming had some Scottish ancestors, and there's a kind of reference to how Caspar, when he's 3, Fleming's determined to dress him up in his mother's Scottish tartan or something. So I think and I think he calls himself in one of his CVs, he calls himself Scottish, not English. So I think Scotland was a very important part of his makeup. And right at the end of his life, it's significant that he is going back. He wants to go back to stay with David Bruce, who is the American ambassador in London, who he'd known in the war in OSS and in London. And Bruce has taken a house up in Scotland, and Fleming has arranged to come and see him because he wants to show his wife and son his childhood haunts, the Fleming haunts, the Robert Fleming haunts. And I think he says, it's a place where you go back to die in Scotland. He refers to it at one place. And I think he very much felt it was his neighborhood, his where he came from, the culture that informed him. There was a Puritanism there that one might say is a bit Scottish, if I was English. It was an element of his makeup. There was a tightness in his dealings with money, which, again, an English person would say is very much a Scottish makeup. Yes, there were elements in his makeup that were Scottish, and he was proud of them.
Mm-hmm. And let's just go on to discuss a little bit more about his career during World War II. So World War II, the Director of Naval Intelligence, Admiral Godfrey. So he's looking for a right-hand man. He gets Fleming. Fleming really discusses or becomes the embodiment of the Director of Naval Intelligence. He represents Britain and America. He's involved in this effort to bring America in the war. He really liaises almost as an equal with the head of MI6 and MI5 and the Special Operations Executive. So just help us understand, like, why is the Director of Naval Intelligence important? Like, to me, I know the answer, and partly it's because of the role that the Navy has played in British history, Britannia rules the waves and all that sort of thing. But help our listeners understand, like, what the Admiralty is and why the Director of Naval Intelligence is important going into the war.
Well, as you say, British history depended largely on the Navy, but as important is that in 1939, after the Germans invaded Poland, and that night, I think, destroy a British passenger liner, that naval intelligence is engaged in a way that military intelligence and Air Force intelligence is not. We don't really engage with Germany again until the Germans invade France and Norway in April, May 1940. So naval intelligence is running the show for the first, 8 months of the war. And they've got all the experience. They're getting the experience. Peter Fleming, interestingly, is performing a job identical to Ian for the head of British military intelligence before he's sent off to Norway. But, you get a sense from that it's a pretty rundown. We all think of naval intelligence and British intelligence now as a kind of sophisticated thing. But, I think in the 30s, it boiled down to a few journalists who were paid to kind of tell them what they'd seen in China. Or I don't think it was this amazingly organized operation. And under Fleming and Godfrey, it had to become much more organized. And it had to spread its tentacles very quickly. He was doing Air Force reconnaissance, Fleming was, Sidney Cotton. He was getting this Spitfire to take photographs of German ports to bring back so they could decipher what the movements of German ships. This is all stuff that the army isn't able to do, and the Air Force isn't really up to doing at that moment. So the Navy was already quite an important section of British armed forces, but it was the one that was really engaged from day one and had a kind of 8-month head start. So by the time we have France collapse, naval intelligence is kind of running the show, basically, and probably given more funds and listened to more. And Fleming has made all his connections with the Joint Intelligence Staff and etc.
It's quite interesting. Although, like you say, it's not this sophisticated machine that's running when the war begins. There is a template from World War I that is sort of used or built out in World War II. So I'm thinking of the Director of Naval Intelligence during World War I, Reginald Blinker Hall. He advises Admiral Godfrey, the Director of Naval Intelligence during World War II. He says, get yourself a right-hand man, a corkscrew thinker who can assist you. This leads to the search for Fleming. Then, of course, in World War I, we have Room 40, which is an early path breaker and code breaking, and that's, splendid British amateurism at its best. It's, eccentric chess players sitting in the bath and, trying to crack codes and so forth. And then during the Second World War, Fleming is in Room 39. So there's a sort of chime, there's a template in which they can build off of from World War II. So he's there He's a right-hand person to Godfrey. Then help us understand just a couple of the things that he's involved in. So maybe we can talk about Operation Mincemeat or Operation Goldeneye, just to give our listeners a flavour of the types of things that he was involved in.
Well, what has kind of submerged Fleming a tiny bit, unfairly, is that stories like Operation Mincemeat and Operation Goldeneye have tended to colour our perception rather dramatically of what Fleming got up to in the war. I mean, these are fun stories. Mincemeat comes about through him recommending a book he'd read by an old Etonian policeman that was in his library that suggested planting a body with false documents. And this was taken up by Ewan Montague in his department and became Operation Mincemeat in 1943, when a Welsh tramp is dressed up as a soldier floating off Cadiz with documents that will mislead the Germans into the invasion of Sicily. And Ben Macintyre's written a brilliant book about that, a film's been made. But I mean, Fleming, he spent probably 10 minutes on it suggesting the idea. Similarly, Goldeneye, which, has a great name, Goldeneye is an umbrella term for lots of different eventualities if the Germans invaded the Spanish peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula. And if the Germans invaded and the Spanish didn't resist them, then that fell into two separate elements of Goldeneye. I can't remember, there was Operation Sconce and one other thing. So that it was all eventualities that would happen if Germany invaded the Iberian Peninsula. But Germany never did invade it, so Goldeneye never happened. But it was set up, lots of agents who would perform kind of guerrilla tactics against the Spanish or the Germans. And there was a cave, Operation Tracer in Gibraltar, which Fleming and Godfrey had the idea of establishing a cave, and it was built with 6 men, were trained, and they were going to sit there while the Germans invaded Gibraltar, and they were going to look out over the straits with binoculars, and they were given 10,000 gallons of water and a bicycle pump to bring oxygen in, and they were going to report back to England on German movements. Well, that was set up, it never happened. Far more important for the course of the war was stuff that hasn't been so celebrated, which was Fleming's use of his banking connections to help a really rotten kind of Spanish character who was marvellous and who was probably very much contributed to our idea of a Bond villain, and who was a Spanish businessman, ruthless, who always kind of, fished in whatever sea was advantageous to him. So in the First World War, I think he'd told Britain to pay him to give for the oil he would give them, and then he told the Germans which boats the oil was in so they could destroy the boats. So he was a complete rascal. But during the Second World War, he came up with a plan that he approached Godfrey in naval intelligence, and I think Fleming wrote up the report. We don't know where it is, but it's likely that Fleming did this report, which suggested that the Spanish could get hold of 59 ships, currently German-owned, in Spain, and the British would buy them off the Spanish, and that would be quite helpful. A bit kind of anticipating of the Lend-Lease program that America and Britain went into the following year, when America lends or leases Britain destroyers in exchange for bases in the Caribbean. So Fleming is deputed, because of his banking connections, to kind of release money to pay. He's called Juan March.
Juan March. And he's the richest and allegedly the most unscrupulous man in Spain. And he had financed Franco's coming to power. And he was totally finger in every pie. And I think Fleming was rather mesmerized by him. And so Fleming was deputed to liaise with Juan March to release funds from the British Treasury using Fleming's banking connections to pay Juan March for the boats that he would be selling. I don't know how much use they were to the British. But then the second thing happened was that after the invasion of France, Juan March came up with a second suggestion that he could bribe something like 8 of Franco's generals
to stop Franco from letting the Germans come into the peninsula. Because if the Germans entered Spain and Portugal, really it was going to be curtains for the British, because they would be able to control the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. And so the two things Churchill wanted in 1940 was to stop the Germans invade the Iberian Peninsula and to keep Spain and Portugal neutral, but to bring in neutral America on the British side. So Fleming was involved in all these two attempts to kind of help Churchill's plans. But Fleming was able to bribe, using, again, his banking connections. He was able to send money to bribe these Spanish generals, and it had a big effect. I mean, they told Franco that he mustn't let the Germans in. These are unsung and much more important operations than the more famous Operation Mincemeat and Goldeneye. And so I think he had other important operations like the 30-year... I mean, one of the biggest successes was 30AU captured the entire German naval archives in Tambach in 1945. And Fleming went out, as the war was raging, just before the surrender. He went out from Paris in a car all the way to this castle to secure what was an extraordinary trove, one of the greatest archival troves probably ever captured by one country, the entire German naval records.
SpyCast listeners will have heard Andrew and I talk about our new temporary exhibit, Bond in Motion, for a while now. It's been open since March 1st, and it will stay here through April of 2025. So make sure you head down to the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. while you can to see this fantastic collection of 17 different vehicles from the James Bond franchise. You've heard how great this exhibit is from Andrew and I, but how about hearing from one of the men who actually drove in these cars? We reached out to George Lazenby, James Bond himself, and On Her Majesty's Secret Service, for a special message for SpyCast listeners. We were lucky enough to hear back, and I'm thrilled to share the following message with you all. My manager brought me to see the Bond in Motion exhibition in 2019 when it was displayed in London, and again in December of 2021 when it was displayed at the Peterson Museum in LA. For me personally, it was very special to see the Cougar again, as it brought back some wonderful memories of making On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I remember Diana Rigg driving that thing for real. She was great behind the wheel. It's funny, when I played The Ultimate Spy, I was a bit of a hippie. I thought all this espionage stuff was a bit dated. Make love, not war, was my motto. The work of preserving these things for the next generations is important to a family man like me with younger kids of my own. My Bond film is a bit of a museum piece now, but I've been told over that directors like Steven Soderbergh and Christopher Nolan figure it to be the best one, so I guess it does hold up. I have fond memories of having a good time with Doug Redenius, who helps keep these cars going at the Ian Fleming Foundation. Bond is the gift that keeps giving. I guess every 6 or 7 years, it's 1969 again. Only love, George.
And when you were speaking there, it reminded me a little bit like Alec Guinness. What you're saying is almost it's a little bit like Operation Mincemeat and GoldenEye, or a little bit like Star Wars for Alec Guinness. He always bemoaned that that's what he became known for, but he had this storied career beforehand where he was a Shakespearean actor, The Bridge over the River Kwai, all of these pivotal movies in the 50s and so forth, but he became known as Obi-Wan Kenobi. So what you're basically saying is that the contribution of helping to bring America into the war, helping to keep the Nazis out of the Iberian Peninsula, and then the 30th Assault Unit and T-Force are really the big things that he should be remembered for in terms of British intelligence during World War II?
Yes. I mean, again, it's hard to be specific about his contribution, but when you look at all these pieces put together, it does form an amalgam of somebody who was far more important than a chocolate sailor. I mean, Fleming, at the end of the war, was chairing JIC meetings. Now, you don't do that if you're in charge of ashtrays. And he was helping to contribute to the Bland Report, which was looking at what a future British intelligence would look like after the war. And he makes very interesting recommendations which anticipate modern drones and anticipate some of the conflict zones in the post-war period. And he anticipates cyber warfare in his suggestions. This is done in 1945. And it seemed that, and he's in charge, he actually chairs Joint Intelligence Bureau meetings in August 1945, about the future of British intelligence.
Tell us just how important was he in terms of bringing America into the war? So obviously, it's not like Ian Fleming gets involved, America comes into the war, the whole thing is overdetermined. Pearl Harbor brings America into the war, etc. But just help us understand the role that he played in the British effort to try to bring America and American sensibilities round to their predicament and to entering the war in an allied fashion.
Well, it was not only Fleming, because William Stevenson, who I've mentioned earlier, who was in charge, the Canadian in charge of British intelligence in North America, Canada, and the Caribbean, he, a great friend of William Donovan, he was devoting many of his resources to persuade the American public to not be like Charles Lindbergh and to see that Germany posed a real threat to America as well. And so there were wonderful stories of Fleming's best friend Ivor Bryce went to work for Stevenson and did this fake map of South America because he had Peruvian connections and had married a Brazilian wife. And he created this map of Nazi intentions that was smuggled to Roosevelt, who then did a famous broadcast saying, I have in my hand a map that shows what Nazis are going to do in South America. So although Roosevelt would have been impeached if people had known the extent to which he was helping the British at a point when he was neutral, Roosevelt was very much pro-British and pro what Admiral Godfrey was trying to persuade him to do, which was to set up an American intelligence service that would be able to liaise with the British. So this was taking place in the 6 months before Pearl Harbor. So Fleming didn't bring America into the war, but when America came into the war, there was a whole setup that would allow American intelligence to flourish. And this also, I would add Camp X, which Stevenson had set up in Canada to train American operatives. I mean, that became very important for William Donovan's men and future CIA people in OSS to be trained there under British instructors, it has to be said, Scottish instructors. And they went off to the Far East, to India, to the Philippines, and, having been trained by the Brits. So I would not make claims that Fleming brought America to the war, but I would say he facilitated, once America came into the war, the easiness of their interaction with British intelligence. And so it was completely seamless until Burgess and Maclean, the kind of trustingness of British and intelligent and American operatives. And in fact, many of Fleming's friends, that he met then became friends later on. Alan Dulles, who became head of the CIA, he knew Fleming. Dulles became a Bond fan, as did Kennedy, who'd also been in naval intelligence.
And he helps to draft a blueprint for what American intelligence will go on to look like, what the Office of Strategic Services will look like.
That's right. In Donovan's house in Georgetown, and also in Fleming's friend Peter Smithers' house in Georgetown. Smithers talks about how they would sit together, working hard, drafting what would be the American intelligence service. And Ivor Bryce also says something it's hard to credit, but Fleming produced a 70-page document in the British Embassy. He was locked up in the British Embassy until he'd finished this document. Now, all this is mouth-watering if it exists, but sufficient evidence still survives that 4 memos were written, at least, and then there's all the kind of oral contributions that Fleming made. Fleming had already met Donovan in Europe when he came to visit British intelligence, the setup in 1940. So they already knew each other. He wasn't flying into a person he didn't know. And I think Donovan and Fleming kind of really, they were birds of a feather. They liked extravagant gestures, imaginative gestures. I think Donovan was rather keen on this exploding donkey turd. He was keen on some powder that would make Hitler's voice go falsetto. Fleming was very keen on exploding cigars that he would give to Castro, which he'd got from a book written in 1902 or something, a thriller writer. So I think they had the same imaginative approach to intelligence.
And just as we get towards the end of the interview, it's been amazing to speak to you, and I could speak all day. I'm just thinking as well of the role that he plays. You bring this out in the book, the role that he plays in even the American presidency. He has an intimate supper with JFK. I done some research online for the inauguration of Richard Helms as CIA director in 1966. LBJ references 007. Ronald Reagan says, I believe he's a symbol of real value to the free world. Donald Trump, when Sean Connery dies, he says, the legendary actor 007 Sean Connery has passed over into even greener fairways. He says this on Twitter. So the Fleming and Fleming's creation are really rippling down through the most powerful office in the world, really. It's quite interesting.
Well, to me, that was the most interesting chapter, and I nearly began the book with it. This is a dinner that takes place in 1960, March 1960. Kennedy is a young senator who's probably going to, he's going to be elected later that year in November, president. So Fleming would have known that this is quite an important person. And Fleming is visiting an old friend, Otzi Leiter, in Georgetown. And Otzi has known Kennedy for years. And in fact, Kennedy now lives in her old house in Georgetown. And it's Otzi who has recommended James Bond to Kennedy. When he had back problems, he wanted something to read. So Otzi sent him Casino Royale, and ever since then had sent him each new Fleming book. So cut to March 1940, Fleming's gone to visit Otzi with a new novel in his briefcase. On his way back from Jamaica to London, he calls in to Washington. They're driving through Georgetown, and suddenly she sees Jack and Jackie walking from Trinity Church, and she stops and she says, Jack, I've been trying to get hold of you. Your phone doesn't work, but I've got Ian Fleming here. And he leans into the window and says, not the Ian Fleming. In another version, he says, not the James Bond is another version, which shows you how the two characters are easily intermingled. Anyway, they go to dinner that night, Otzi and Fleming, and there are 6 people, as far as 6 other people. And what happens that night is extraordinary because there's a thorny issue of Cuba that has been vexing America since 1958. Fleming had sent Norman Lewis, a journalist, an intelligence man, to try and find out what was going on in Cuba. Fleming had big connections to Cuba through his grandfather. His grandfather had funded the Cuban railway, the sugar industry, et cetera, in the First World War. Fleming had his house in Jamaica, which was 90 miles from Cuba. So when, after dinner, Kennedy says to Fleming, what would James Bond do about Castro? It's not a frivolous question, which I think too often it's been seen as. He's really asking, what would Ian Fleming do about Castro? The Ian Fleming who worked in naval intelligence when I was in naval intelligence, who worked around the corner with Colonel Donovan setting up what is now the CIA, who did lots of black operations in the Second World War and gave Colonel Donovan ideas for these. What would Ian Fleming do? And Fleming uses this as he knows this is his opportunity, just as when he sat down with Admiral Godfrey at the Carlton to be interrogated for a job, he knew that was his opportunity. So I'd say this is the second most important meal of his life. And he goes into the stratosphere with suggestions about what you would do to Castro based on many of his black ops in the Second World War. You know, there was one famous thing, he'd shower them with fake Cuban pesos so the inflation would run riot. He would transmit a beam into the sky, a cross, which would, having announced that Castro was dead, to say this was the second coming. But most funnily, he said he would distribute leaflets that said that the Americans had been conducting nuclear experiments in the region, and the fallout would cause men with beards, their hair to fall out. Well, as you know, Castro's men were known as the barbudos, the bearded ones. And so this would be a terrible affront to their manhood. And so this kind of stuff, this was manna to Kennedy's ear, and he just thought this was terrific. He was bewitched by Fleming. He loved all his books. He saw himself as a James Bond figure. And then he tries to get hold the following day. Alan Dulles in New York is about to have, or in Washington, is about to have a meeting on that Monday to green light secret operation against Castro, which Eisenhower will green light 3 days later and give them $13 million or whatever. And he says, you've got to get hold of Ian. He's got these fantastic ideas for how to deal with Castro. Ian couldn't be got hold of. He was taking his new manuscript Thunderball to his agent in America to try and get it filmed. And I don't think he was got hold of. But what happens is that when you have the Bay of Pigs a year later, so much of the Bay of Pigs is framed in a James Bond paradigm.
So with regards to Castro and then the Church and Pike Committee hearings, we see wartime corkscrew thinking manifesting itself during the Cold War. So that's one part of what you're saying. And then the other one, I think, is that even if Ian Fleming had never put pen to paper, he's still an important historical actor in his own right. But you know, the fact that he did put his pen to paper, I mean, you have some headlines from newspapers in your book. You know, he's in the news every single day. There's one here, bikini worn by Dr. No Bond girl Ursula Andress to sell for $500,000, which is absolutely incredible. Diana Riggs obituary, who's a major figure in her own sphere. Only women to marry James Bond. Diana Riggs obituary in the Times. I mean, it's an insane and incredible cultural legacy that he's bequeathed. But final question, you mentioned at the beginning that you're a novelist who has done some non-fiction, who done the book 6 Minutes in May, I think, on the Norway crisis. Then you got approached by the Fleming estate to write this book. As a novelist, how significant is Fleming as a writer? How significant is he as a novelist? I guess that's a difficult question to ascertain because, you know, the questions of the canon and who's a writer and for which audience and so forth. But just as a novelist, like, what's your take on Fleming?
My take on Fleming would be Fleming's take on himself, that he is a good front row storyteller, like Somerset Maugham, like John Buchan, whom he greatly admired. In a sense, Fleming modelled himself on Richard Hannay, Buchan's hero, hiding in plain sight. And I think he would have liked to have done a book, as he said, that had elements of Tolstoy and Eric Ambler and Evelyn Waugh. The people he really admired of his contemporaries were Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene, but he knew that he wasn't up to their level, and nor necessarily could he have been, because he only devoted 2 months of his year to writing the book, and it had to be done at great speed, which is what gave it its energy. But he would never have considered, spending 2 or 3 years on a book, which is what they did. And so I think he always knew that he never had extravagant claims for himself, which I think is attractive about him. He's the Georges V rather than the Ritz in Paris, somebody described him, and he knew that. So I'd say second row front, and he was happy with that position, but I don't think we'd be talking about him even so, had the films not been made, because whatever the ingredients of Bond, as a kind of both a hero of modernization, but also as a symbol of retrospective power, the films have allowed this protean creature to exist in the future, in the present, and so that almost all over the world, the words, the names Bond, James Bond, will ignite a smile. And so I think that is his achievement, and I think he'd be pleased with that, rather than the fact that he wasn't going to win the Nobel Prize for literature. But then nor did John le Carré, who regarded himself as a much greater writer, quite rightly. John le Carré was a much greater writer, but whether he had as much influence as Ian Fleming through his character, I mean, Bond is cited every day in the press and will continue to be in a way that George Smiley is not.
It's a pretty incredible legacy, and congratulations on the book. It's a fantastic achievement, and there's so much in there. I hope many of our listeners get themselves a hold of a copy and have as much fun doing so as I did. Thanks ever so much for your time.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of SpyCast. Please follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have feedback, you can reach us by email at spycast@spymuseum.org or on Twitter @INTL_SpyCast. Coming up in next week's show.
When the bombing started, President Zelensky and his team understood that this was the nightmare scenario that the Americans had been predicting. And indeed the worst case, the most aggressive approach to the invasion that the Russians could have taken.
If you go to our page, thecyberwire.com/podcasts/SpyCast, you can find links to further resources, detailed show notes, and full transcripts. I'm Erin Dietrich, and your host is Dr. Andrew Hammond. The rest of the team involved in the show is Mike Mincy, Memphis Vaughn III, Emily Coletta, Emily Renz, Afua Anakla, Ariel Samuel, Elliot Peltzman, Trey Huster, and Jen Iben. This show is brought to you from the home of the world's preeminent collection of intelligence and espionage-related artifacts, the International Spy Museum.